Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our very first virtual book event of 2021. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Kate Bruns, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, the Harvard University Division of Science, the Harvard Library, and our co-sponsor tonight, the Leakey Foundation, I am so pleased to introduce this event with Daniel Lieberman, discussing his latest book, Exercised: Why Something We Never Evolved to Do is Healthy and Rewarding. Tonight's lecture is the latest installment in our Harvard Science Book Talk series, which works to bring the authors of recently published science-related literature to our Cambridge community and now beyond. To learn more about upcoming science book talks when they're announced, you can sign up for the bookstore's email newsletter at harvard.com or visit the webpage harvard.com/science. We also have a Science Research Public Lecture Series YouTube page where you can watch any previous talks that you might have missed. This evening's event is going to conclude with some time for your questions. If you would like to ask Dr. Lieberman something, please go to the Q&A chat at the bottom of your screen where you can submit your question. We're going to get through as many as time allows for this evening. Also, once the event begins, I'm going to be posting a link in the chat to purchase tonight's featured book, Exercised. All sales through this link support Harvard Bookstore, so thank you for your patronage, your purchases and your contributions, and I'll also be dropping a donate link in the chat, make this virtual author series possible, and now more than ever ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you to our partners at Harvard University, and thank you to all of you for tuning in and showing up for our authors, indie bookselling, and especially for science. And finally, as you might have experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues can arise. And if they do, I'm going to do my best to resolve them quickly. But before I introduce tonight's speaker, I would also like to play a brief video welcome from President of the Leakey Foundation, Camilla Smith. So please bear with me while I pull that up.
My name is Camilla Smith, and I'm president of the Leakey Foundation. For over 50 years, the Leakey Foundation has been dedicated to supporting human origins research and sharing discoveries with the general public in programs like this. We explore the big questions of what it means to be human. And we do this by funding research of scientists like our speaker, Dr. Daniel Lieberman. We share this research through events like this and online in our lunch break science series and also in our Origin Stories podcasts. Dr. Lieberman has done remarkable research in how Homo sapiens bodies work as compared to other mammals and to the other great apes. He is not only a Leakey Foundation grantee, he has also made significant contributions to the foundation as a member of our Science Executive Committee. We are thrilled to welcome you all to today's event and to be part of celebrating Dr. Lieberman's most recent book. You can visit us at leakeyfoundation.org and learn more about the Leakey Foundation, Daniel Lieberman, as well as how you can help support this research and our other educational programs. Thank you.
All right, so now I am delighted to introduce tonight's speaker. Paleoanthropologist Daniel Lieberman is the Edwin M. Lerner Professor of Biological Sciences and Professor of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard University. A graduate from Harvard himself, he is the author of the previous books, The Evolution of the Human Head, and the national bestseller, The Story of the Human Body, Evolution, Health, and Disease. As described by Camilla, his research is on how and why the human body is the way it is and the relevance of human evolution to contemporary health. Tonight, he is discussing his latest book, Exercised, praised by NPR as exceptionally informative and highly appealing. They write, quote, Lieberman makes a superb guide for anyone wishing to understand why it can be hard to commit to exercising and why we should do it anyway. And one of our former Science Book Talk speakers, Neil Shubin, calls the book part user manual for the human body and part detective story exploring our evolution, celebrating how exercise will change the way that you think about exercise, diet, and your own well-being. We are so grateful to have Daniel Lieberman virtually here with us tonight. So without further ado, Dan, the virtual podium is yours.
Thank you so much, Kate, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Let me see if, I'm sorry we can't be in the same room, but I guess such is the nature of life in the pandemic here. So let me share my screen and let's see if this works. So once again, thank you so much for this opportunity, and I'm really pleased to be here thanks to the Leakey Foundation, the Harvard Bookstore, the Division of Science, the Harvard Library, to talk about Exercised, why something we never evolved to do is healthy and rewarding. And by the way, today's the day the book came out in the US. So this is kind of our kind of big launch party. So thank you so much for being here. Really, really grateful. And if I just want to start off with the observation that if the audience here is kind of representative of the US as a whole, we can guess that about 20% of you get your sort of recommended minimal dose of physical activity. The US government, the World Health Organization, so basically everybody in every sort of medical organization on the planet suggests that we get 150 minutes of exercise a week. And it turns out only about 20% of Americans succeed in doing that. So that means the other 80% of us hate it, right? And many of them, as we know from interviews and from data, are ambivalent about physical activity and exercise. They're confused, they feel anxious, they feel bullied in the word, they feel exercised about exercise. And so, you know, for them and for many other people, I think there's a kind of degree of trepidation when you approach a book or a talk about exercise. I mean, we're all kind of sick of, you know, easy, you know, 7 steps to running a marathon kinds of books. And you know, much as I could probably make a lot more money by doing that, I promise that that's not what we're going to be doing today, and nor that is what my book is about. Instead, what I'd really like to do is to try to inform us all more about what exercise is and its evolutionary history, with the goal of making us less exercised about this topic. But before I go any further, first things first, there are a lot of people I'd like to thank, and I especially want to thank my phenomenal editor, Errol McDonald at Random House. He's got really high standards, and I've tried to live up to them. My agent, Max Brockman, has been just superlative. And there are many, many, many dear and wonderful colleagues who have read many chapters of this book and commented and helped in all kinds of ways. I don't have time to read them all, and I probably left some off this list. But I really want to thank each and every one of them. They've really helped this book come along enormously. Especially my wife, Tonya, who read every chapter, and my running buddy, Dr. Aaron Bagish, who's also worked really hard helping me on this. He often overruns in the morning. Okay, so for the next 30 minutes or so, what I'd like to do is first talk about why I wrote this book and what it's about. And then the second part of the talk, I'd like to use sort of the structure of the book to talk about some of the myths of exercise. And it'll be kind of a rapid and sort of cursory tour of what's obviously a much more in-depth book. So first, let's talk about how this book started. So, you know, sometimes things really do have an origin. And I can say that the origin of this book began in 2012 when I was finishing up my last book, The Story of the Human Body. And I was really lucky to get invited to probably one of the best junkets on the planet. I was invited, there's a medical conference that precedes the Ironman World Championship every year in Kona, Hawaii. And I got invited to this amazing conference, which basically takes place over a week. And this is the view from the conference hotel. So you can see it's not a tough place to spend a week. And now I wasn't there to participate in the race. I was there to observe it and to participate in this medical conference. And if you've ever seen a full Ironman, it's an extraordinary thing to see, right? So first of all, they do a 2.4-mile open water swim. Just saying that gives me heart palpitations. And then they jump off jump out of the water and jump onto bikes and do just a a trivial kind of 112-mile bicycle race across the lava fields of Kona. And then when they get back, it's already about 90 degrees Fahrenheit, so they add a marathon, right? A full 26.2-mile marathon. It's an extraordinary thing to watch. And if you see that, you really understand why the motto of Ironman is anything is possible. And for the year I was there in 2012, this is the guy who won that year. He's basically a cyborg, not really a human being. He managed to do all that in just a little bit over 8 hours, and he looks kind of fresh as a daisy, actually, when he crossed the finish line. But the really exciting moments in the race occur at the end, because you have to finish by midnight to be considered a finisher. And this was the last finisher of the year, of that year. Her name was Harriet Anderson. She was 77 years old, and she did it in just under 17 hours. And here she is being greeted by the women's winner. So you can just, it's just a marvelous thing to watch the ability of human beings to do this kind of extreme endurance, especially in 8 hours, or for that matter, at the age of 77. So, but would I ever want to do that? No way, no way in hell. I mean, I left Kona thinking that is not for me, especially the swimming part. No way would I do that. And then when I got home, again, remember, I'm just finishing up this book on the evolution of the human body, and I've been thinking about, about health and whatever. But then a few weeks later, I packed my bags and I was off again on another trip, this time to northern Mexico, to do some research with the Tarahumara. So this is in the Sierra Tarahumara. This is actually a photograph I took on that trip. It's one of the most beautiful places I've ever been on the planet, but it's extremely remote. With my help of my colleague and friend, Mickey Mahaffey, we were basically driving on these little, up these roads into these crazy, very, very, very remote areas, and this 2x4, and sleeping on floors of pueblos. And I was measuring people's feet and studying people's running. And but I have to say, though, although the Tarahumara are extremely famous for running, I never saw anybody running unless I paid them to do that, until I got a chance to see one of their famous races, actually two of their famous races. So there's both a men's race and a women's race. And the men's race is called Aurora Hippari. And it's kind of like a marathon combined with kind of soccer. There's a little tiny little wooden ball. Actually, I've got one over here. You can see it, but it's a little wooden ball, and they flick it with their feet. And then they chase it, and then they kick it again, and then they chase it, and they kick it again. And they do this sometimes for up to 50 or 60 miles. And there are two teams, and the team that laps the other one eventually wins. It's an extraordinary race to watch. There's also a women's race, which is also just spectacular. It's called an aruete. Instead of a ball, they have a hoop, a cloth hoop, and they use these sticks to flick them. And usually those races last about just a marathon. And so I got a chance to see these amazing races. But other than that, I didn't see anybody running ever, unless I paid them. So there I was traveling around, and I was thinking about Ironman and these incredible people and all the sort of pain and suffering they put themselves through. And then I saw this wonderful, beautiful races that are also kind of similar in terms of endurance and difficulty, but very different in some ways and very similar in other ways. Anyway, but I was also measuring people's feet, and I was talking to people, and I had my little, I was being a good anthropologist, and I had my set of questions, and I was asking everybody about how much they ran and how they trained for running. And every time I asked anybody about how they trained, I ran into trouble, because the translator I was working with kept struggling to explain what training was to the Tarahumara, but they don't actually have a word for training in their culture. So she was explaining that, this guy, this gringo who's talking to you, he runs 5 miles every morning to kind of get fit. And then this one guy, who I'll call Ernesto, I'll never forget him, because I was told, a very famous runner. And in fact, I got a chance to watch him running in the Aurora Hippari. And when I asked him the question, he looked at me and he said, "Why would anybody run if they didn't have to?" And I remember kind of laughing in embarrassment, and then realized it makes sense, right? Because for people like the Tarahumara, and for that matter, for pretty much everybody until recently, people were very physically active, but they didn't do what we would call exercise. So it's important to understand this distinction, right? Physical activity is any bodily movement produced by skeletal muscles that expends energy. It's basically moving, right? But exercise is discretionary. It's voluntary physical activity to sustain or improve health and fitness, right? You go to the gym to exercise. You go run 5 miles in the morning to exercise. But the Tarahumara, when they do their long distance runs, they don't think of it as a form of exercise. They actually think of it as a form of prayer. And to me, the apotheosis of exercise is the treadmill. I mean, think about it. you pay money either to buy one of these things or to go to a gym to use one of these things, to work really, really hard. It's noisy, it's loud, it's kind of treacherous, it's boring as hell, and it gets you nowhere, right? Try explaining that to like your great grandparents, like that you would actually spend your own hard-earned cash to torture yourselves on one of these things. I generally hate treadmills, even though I put them on people on them for a living. And I had a sort of another sort of experience that kind of made me think about this, because I've been, for the last 12 years, I've been working in this community in Western Kenya called Pemja. And it's a beautiful place. It's way high up on the Western Rift Valley. In fact, you can see, I don't know if you can see in the photo there, but down in the distance, that's Lake Victoria, and that's the town of Kisumu. That's where Barack Obama's father was born. Anyway, in this area of Kenya, it's very, very rural and very poor. There's no electricity, there's no running water. There's no machines. People do all their labor by hand or with the help of animals. And women especially carry huge loads all the time. They carry water, they carry firewood. So we were kind of interested in that. And so my graduate students and I and my Kenyan colleagues, so we decided to bring a treadmill up to the area and study women while they were carrying loads on these treadmills, with an oxygen analysis system, so we could measure how much energy they're spending. So we schlepped up, I bought a treadmill and we schlepped this treadmill all the way up these dangerous, difficult roads. And I think you get a sense from this video of just how difficult the driving is there. But when we got there and put people on the treadmill, they had a hard time doing it. And you too would have a hard time walking on a treadmill if you had never walked on one before. It's a really weird, bizarre, and strange thing. And people didn't really like it. And we realized that we had to abandon the treadmill and study people as they were walking over ground. It was just a complete waste of time and money. And by the way, just so you know, just to kind of add to my story about treadmills, did you know that the modern treadmill was basically invented by a guy named William Cubitt in the Victorian period to punish prisoners, because they were worried that people in debtors' prisons and other prisons in England were relaxing and having too much fun. So they invented these treadmills to basically keep them trudging all day long and make them miserable. Oscar Wilde, for example, had to trudge for about 6 hours a day on one of these treadmills. So if you hate a treadmill, there's a good reason. It has a history of people hating it. So how did I end up putting people on treadmills, as this poor guy is in my lab, and studying and writing about the evolution of human physical activity? Well, for me, it's actually a long and kind of interesting story, because I'm by no means the kind of person I would have ever associated with exercise and physical activity when I was growing up. So here's me in, I think, 6th or 7th grade. That's me in that little red circle there. I was a total nerd. I was very physically insecure. I wasn't very good at anything. I know it's a cliche, but I really was picked last for most teams all the time. I once hid in a closet during gym, so I didn't have to go to gym class. I was the standard kind of typical nerd. And but I had a wonderful role model. I didn't sort of realize it at the time, but my mother. This is my mother here. And by the way, my father, who's a great photographer, takes pictures all the time, but he doesn't have a single picture of her running. But my mother started running in 1969 when she was 33. This is really before the running boom, because the University of Connecticut, where she was teaching at the time, built this fancy schmancy new gym, and they wouldn't let women use it. And she ran with some friends to liberate the gym. And then she became hooked. And she started running about 5 miles a day, which she did for about 50 decades. And she still exercises regularly every day. And, I just thought, well, that's what mothers do, right? I didn't realize when I was a kid how extraordinary and heroic she was. So I grew up with parents who were physically active. My father also ran with my mother. And on family holidays, we would go hiking and skiing and stuff like that. So, we didn't really do sports, but my parents were certainly encouraged me to be physically active. So I did have that kind of background, but I didn't really think about it very much, of course, until recently. And then I grew up and became a professor. And for much of my career, I was a head guy. I focused on skulls. But I started studying, getting interested in the problem of how humans, because we're bipeds, we walk and run on 2 legs, how it is that humans keep our head still. Because remember, I'm a head guy, right? I'm a skull guy. How do we keep our head still when we run? Because unlike animals like this pig, which can flex and extend its neck to keep its head stable, we're like pogo sticks. So turns out we have this interesting structure called the nuchal ligament. And with my colleague, Dennis Bramble, we started studying it. We started doing biomechanics in the lab and taking people's heads off and making them run, as you can see from this video. And that got me interested in how people ran back in the old days. And in 2004, Dennis Bramble and I published this paper in Nature, which was on the cover of Nature said, Born to Run. Of course, the actual title of the paper was much more academic. And we spent many years writing that paper, but the basic argument of the paper was that humans evolved to be long distance runners. And that running, is, in addition to walking, was important in human evolution. And of course, if humans evolved to run millions of years ago, they must have been running barefoot because shoes were only invented recently. So I then started studying barefoot running, and that led to another paper in Nature. And then soon thereafter, I wrote the book, The Story of the Human Body, which is really about how and why our bodies are the way they are. And of course, the fact that I was studying running got me interested more in my own running. So I was always a bit of a jogger, following my mother. I would, in high school, I would run occasionally in the streets near our house. And in college, I would occasionally do a short little loop around the Charles River when I was an undergraduate. But I was never a serious runner. And it wasn't until I started working on this paper on the evolution of running that I really started to seriously up my running. And in 2007, I thought I'd better put my money where my mouth was. So I actually ran my first marathon, and I've become a bit of an addict ever since. I've done now 24, I believe. And then because I like to try what I study, I also tried barefoot running, and I thought I should try running against animals. So I, instead of hunting a kudu in Africa, I joined this race in Prescott, Arizona called Man Against Horse. And I basically had a wonderful time over the last 15 years or so, really enjoying running. But when I got into this, I really had no idea what the kind of controversy I was going to get involved with. Now, paleoanthropology is famous for controversy, but you should try barefoot running if you want to try controversy, right? So to my astonishment, when we started publishing about barefoot running, I was sort of caught between these two worlds. So there was this one group of folks who was arguing that basically shoes are evil and they're like coffins for your feet, and barefoot running is better. And then there was another group of folks who were arguing that barefoot running is bad for you, and like anybody who runs barefoot is like probably a polygamist or some communist or something like that. And most people were just completely confused. And it made me realize that so many people are just exercised about exercise, right? Now, the word exercise means to be vexed, worried, anxious, and harassed. And for example, in terms of the barefoot running debate, people were wondering, is it better to run barefoot or not? Will running ruin my knees? How much should I run? But there were also so many other questions I was hearing. How do I get myself to exercise in the first place? How much weight should I do? How much cardio should I do? And how much sleep should I get? And is my chair out to kill me? And so on and so on. I think we're really extremely exercised in this country about exercise. But of course, the biggest problem of all is that most people aren't really getting enough exercise, right? Now, and everybody knows that exercise is healthy. I mean, we've known that for thousands of years. Every culture on the planet knows that. And yet we struggle to get enough, right? According to the CDC and various other kind of organizations that kind of track this, only about 20% of Americans get the recommended minimum dose of exercise that we are considered recommended to get. I'll talk more about that dose a little bit later on. But that's 150 minutes a week of moderate exercise, or 75 minutes a week of vigorous exercise. So that, for me, raises some questions, like why are we so exercised about exercise? Well, I think one reason is that we're confused, right? We're constantly barraged with kind of contradictory information that often creates kind of whiplash. Like, so one day you can read just about how wonderful running is for you, and then the next day you can read about runners getting dying like Pheidippides at the end of the marathon, right? And then another day you can read about how important aerobic physical activity is for your health, and another day you can read about how important it is to do weights, and weights prevent aging. And people just don't know really how to make sense of all this. These little bits of information that are often disjointed and often contradictory. I think another really big problem is that so much of the lens that we use to evaluate exercise has to do with weight loss. And that sort of makes sense because a lot of people in this country are struggling to lose weight, but weight loss is not the only raison d'etre to run or walk or swim or cycle or whatever it is you like to do. And it gives us a very narrow perspective on exercise. We'll talk a bit more about that later on. And then the other extreme is that we talk a lot about elite athletes, right? The fastest, the strongest, these amazing people. But I can tell you that most of these folks have very little to do with you and me in terms of how their physiology and its effects on their health. To me, it's a bit akin to focusing too much on sort of supermodels instead of normal people when we think about what's a normal human body. But I think that the biggest problem is that we have a very Western post-industrial bias. Almost all the data that we have about physical activity comes from people from America and Europe. So about 80% of the data, according to a study that we recently did. And yet that represents only a sliver of humanity. The other 90% of the world is very different. And of course, for most of human evolution, people have lived very differently from the lives that we live today. And so I thought it would be a useful and interesting and fun and rewarding experience to try to write a natural history of physical activity. And there are sort of two mantras that run through this book. The first is that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And that's because we weren't designed, we weren't engineered, we evolved. And if you understand why our bodies are the way they are, you need to understand that evolutionary history. But also we're humans, right? And humans have culture and we're complicated. And if you want to understand human behavior, you need to think about human behavior in the light of anthropology. And so the book is organized as a kind of a natural history, because of course, if you want to understand physical activity, you also have to understand physical inactivity. So I begin the book with a natural sort of history and evolutionary history of physical inactivity, like sitting and sleeping and resting. Then, because we originally evolved to be fast and strong, I look at the evolution of speed and strength. And then, because there was important selection in human evolution for endurance, especially I think running, but also walking. We next talk about endurance. And then the final part of the book applies parts 1 through 3 to health today and how exercise works in the modern world. And so I've tried to weave together information from anthropology and from evolutionary biology, and human biology and health sciences. But because that's this kind of tedious reading, and also try to kind of make it personal, I've tried to weave throughout the book my own experiences, because I've spent the last 20 years as trying to get as much experience as possible in traveling around the world and seeing how people use their bodies. And so I've been to, of course, racing against horses, and the work I've been doing in Africa, and I got a chance to go hunting in Greenland, and the work in Mexico, and the work in the lab, et cetera, et cetera. And I wanted to kind of weave that throughout the book as a kind of a narrative. So the book has 4 sections: inactivity, speed and strength, endurance, and health. And each of these has chapters on particular aspects of physical activity or inactivity. But as a way of kind of addressing the fact that people are so exercised about exercise, I also added to each chapter a discussion of various myths about speed and strength and resting and sitting and sleeping and walking and running and aging, etc. And so as a kind of a way to sort of have a kind of quick look through the book, I thought it would be fun to kind of talk about some of those myths. And I'll sort of just zoom through a few, obviously very briefly. And of course, it's kind of like a glimpse of what I talk about. So the first section of the book, as I said before, is about physical inactivity, because if you want to understand what physical activity is about, we also need to understand what we're doing most of the day, which is being inactive, right? You can't exercise all day long. That's just not possible. In fact, it's not normal. So, and for me, the biggest myth of all about physical activity and about exercise is that we evolved to exercise. In fact, I call this the myth of the athletic savage, because we get this idea from some popular literature and other places that our ancestors were these just amazing athletes, right? They were walking long distances every day. They were carrying huge objects. They were digging and climbing and running and dancing. And all that is true, except it turns out that if you look at how much physical activity hunter-gatherers were doing, and we realized this starting in the 1970s when people were doing research in the Kalahari, that hunter-gatherers actually only sort of active for a few hours a day. In fact, recent research on the Hadza in Tanzania shows that the average Hadza engages in about 2¼ hours of physical activity every day. That's sort of moderate or vigorous. And for the rest of the day, like us, they mostly rest. And they're physically active only when it's necessary or when it's rewarding. So the idea that people were out there, working crazy hard all day long, like kind of like a CrossFit workout, is just simply not true. And so next time you're in a mall or an airport or a subway station like this, right? And your little voice in your head, like all these people, right, is telling you, take the escalator, right? And of course, we didn't evolve in environments that had escalators, but that little voice that's telling you, to kind of to save energy and to not spend energy on needless physical activity, that's a deep and ancient instinct. And so I think we should realize we should be compassionate about that little voice, right? That these folks here, in a way, are being completely normal, right? They're avoiding unnecessary physical activity, whereas this person here, who, by the way, photoshopped onto this, is kind of abnormal, right? She's voluntarily spending extra calories. And in a zero-sum game, when calories are rare, that's energy that we're not spending on other important functions. So another sort of thing, another aspect of physical activity is like when you're physically inactive, what are you doing? Well, most of the time you're sitting, and you've probably heard the phrase that sitting is the new smoking. And there's a lot of public ad campaigns out there trying to get us to sit less. But think about it, you can't exercise all day long. And when you're not exercising, what's more natural than sitting? And in fact, it turns out that when people go to hunter-gatherer camps, this is actually the photo I took when I first walked into this particular camp, that people sit about 9 to 10 hours a day. And if you go to, like most Americans, that's what, and apparently Russians too, that's what they're doing, right? By the way, I just love this photo of Trump and Putin. They look so bored, right? They're clearly not having a great time. So it turns out that we sit pretty much as hunter-gatherers who don't even own chairs. And that's not to say that sitting has no health negative consequences. And it turns out there are better and worse ways to sit. But it turns out that really it's leisure time sitting that's most strongly associated with negative health outcomes. So if you sit all day at work and then you go home and sit all evening, well then of course you're in trouble. But sitting 9 to 10 hours a day is a perfectly normal thing to do. And then I was thinking, well, if we're told to sit less, why are we also told to sleep more? So I ended up sort of really delving into the evolutionary biology of sleep, and it was fascinating because it turns out that this idea that we have that now in the modern world with electricity and iPhones and television and all kinds of other doodads that prevent us from sleeping, that we now sleep less than we used to, that turns out not to be true, because when anthropologists go out into parts of the world where there is no electricity and there are no iPhones and there is no television, it turns out that people don't sleep any more than we do, right? Turns out that you put monitors on them, they sleep between about 5.7 and 7.1 hours a night, which is actually not too different from most Americans. And it is true that if you don't get enough sleep, that has serious negative health consequences. But it's also untrue that 8 hours is actually optimal. This is a graph based on data from millions of people, right? Of the relationship between how many hours they sleep versus their ratio of heart disease. And it turns out that it's a U-shaped curve for both men and women. And for most people, the optimum seems to be around 7. So this idea that 8 hours is absolutely necessary is not true. But the problem is that we then make people exercised about it, right? People think that they're not getting enough sleep, and then they get stressed about it, and stress elevates cortisol, and cortisol is a hormone that makes you aroused and then therefore prevents you from sleeping. So I think we need to be, while sleep is a serious issue, we should be maybe a little bit less prescriptive about it. Okay, so that's inactivity. Part 2 of the book is about speed and strength. And one of the trade-off, the myths that is very common is that there's a strong trade-off between speed and endurance, right? You can either be a tortoise or you can be a hare. And that's a perfect example of our bias on elite athletes. So here's Eliud Kipchoge on the left. He's the world's fastest marathoner. And here's Usain Bolt, who's now retired, but he's the world's fastest 100-meter sprinter. And Kipchoge is running a marathon at 5.9 meters a second. That's like a 440 mile, and he can do that in about 2 hours. Bolt is blazing along at an incredible speed for a human, not so fast for a quadruped, at about 10.4 meters a second. So he can run 100 meters in 9.58 seconds. So if Kipchoge were to run at 100 meters at his pace, he'd run a 16:57. And if Bolt were to run a marathon at his pace, he'd run a blisteringly fast 1:07 marathon. But of course, they can't do that. So there is a trade-off for elite athletes. But for the rest of us, it turns out that trade-off doesn't exist, right? Think about soccer players. They're really good at speed and they're really good at endurance. And the same is true for decathletes and actually for most people, right? For most people, it turns out there is no trade-off between speed and endurance. And over the last few years, we've been learning more and more about high intensity interval training, where you basically do short little bouts of high intensity exercise. And it turns out that one of the major benefits of HIIT, high intensity interval training, is it builds your endurance. So for most of us, there is no trade-off between speed and endurance. They're actually complementary. Another myth out there is that we evolved to be super strong, right? This is like the CrossFit myth, right? The primal fitness myth, right? Our ancestors were out there heaving rocks, right? But it turns out that also is not true. And when people have, anthropologists have gone out and measured hunter-gatherers, they're reasonably strong. In fact, this is a measure of, for example, grip strength among people in the UK. And you can see the hunter-gatherers, this is an average, tend to be about 75th percentile. So they're reasonably strong, but they're not crazy strong. But the key thing about strength in hunter-gatherers is that because they continue to use their bodies to generate force and power, they tend to maintain their strength more as they age. So by the time they're in their 80s, they're actually close to the 90th percentile for 80-year-old Englishmen. And there's a reason for that, and that's use it or lose it, right? Muscle's really expensive. You spend as much energy just taking care of your muscle if you're just sitting in bed as you spend on your brain. It's about 20% of your metabolism. And so extra muscle is a lot of extra energy, and you don't want to have any more muscle than you need. And then a final myth about sort of strength and speed and power is this myth that sports are exercise. If you think about the Olympics, for example, that most of the Olympic events, especially back in the old Olympics, were really about skills that were important for combat. They were about javelin throwing and wrestling and, well, chariot racing, which we don't do anymore. And so many sports around the world. In fact, I described this incredible sport you can still see in Florence, the Calcio Florentino, and football, etc. These are sports that are still kind of retain a kind of a combat flavor to them. And I think that one of the main reasons that sports are a human universal, every culture has sports of one sort or another, is not so much to get people to be physically active, but rather to train people to be warriors, but also to train people to not to be reactively aggressive. So as my colleague Richard Wrangham has written about, there's two kinds of aggression: reactive aggression, which is like when you just without thinking, respond aggressively to something, and proactive aggression, which is voluntarily and controlled. And in sports, we teach people to be good sports, right? Not to be reactively aggressive. It's not acceptable, to beat up an opponent if they score a goal against you, but it is okay to work together to beat the other team. Okay, so part 3 of the book moves on to endurance, because I think this is really probably the most special aspect of human physical activity. And if there's any one sort of most fundamental aspect of human sort of physical activity, it's to walk, right? We are walkers, and we evolved to walk about 7 million years ago when we split from the chimpanzees. Walking is the most fundamental form of physical activity. And hunter-gatherers, so of course, until a few hundred generations ago, everybody was a hunter-gatherer. Hunter-gatherers walk between 6 and 9 miles a day, right? So that's like walking from LA to New York City every year. And so walking is important, but recently there's been a kind of trend to think about sort of walking as being kind of useless for weight loss, right? And there's some basis to this, right? If you walk a mile, you spend about 50 extra calories. But if you eat some fries at McDonald's, you're going to get about 365 calories. So clearly you have to walk a lot to make up for just one serving of fries. And the average American who's trying to lose weight is trying to lose about 50 pounds. And remember, the average recommendation for physical activity is 150 minutes a week. And if you exercise 150 minutes a week, well, your weight loss is going to be very modest for the reasons I just explained. It's just not that much energy is spent by walking. So if you do 150 minutes a week, you might lose ½ pound in a month, and you might lose, if you're lucky, about 6 pounds in a year. But remember, that's just 21 minutes a day of walking, right? And it turns out if you look at slightly more evolutionary doses, like just doubling that to 300 minutes a week, so that's 42 minutes a day, turns out you can lose a pound a month, and you can lose about 12 pounds a year. So it's not true that walking can't help you lose weight. It's just that you're not going to lose a lot of it really fast, and you have to have reasonably large amounts of walking, although I don't think 300 minutes a week is that crazy. But even more importantly, the important benefit of physical activity is not so much for weight loss. If you really want to lose weight, the best thing to do is diet, because you can really go into much more negative energy balance, cut your calories much more by restricting your food intake than by exercising. But what's really important about physical activity is it prevents weight gain or weight regain. And of course, many diets fail, not because people can't lose weight while dieting, it's just that after they finish dieting, they gain the weight back. So here's an example of a study on this. This is actually done on Boston policemen. They had a bunch of policemen, they had them, some of them dieted, some of them dieted and exercised. The ones who exercised lost a little bit more weight than the ones who just dieted. And then after the 8 weeks of diet, when they all lost about 10 to 12 kilos, the ones who didn't exercise gained all their weight back, but the ones who continued to exercise managed to keep the weight off. And so that's really, I think, what's so important about physical activity when it comes to weight loss. So if walking is the most basic, fundamental, moderate form of physical activity, running is by far the most basic and fundamental form of vigorous physical activity. That's right. We evolved to run long distances, and much of the book is, I have a large section of the book to talk about that because that's a big interest of mine. But there's another myth out there about running, which is that it's going to destroy your knees, right? It's like a wear and tear. It's going to cause you to wear down the cartilage of your knees, just like wearing down the springs in your car. And that turns out to be also false, right? Well, in a complicated way. So it's true that the knee is the most common site of injury for running, but it is not true. And there are many prospective studies which show that people who run are not more likely to get arthritis in their knee. In fact, if anything, they're slightly less likely to get running injuries in their knee. And in fact, I talk about this in the book, is that I think a lot of these knee injuries that people are getting are because running is a skill. And we don't teach people to run very well anymore. And also people don't have bodies that are well adapted to the stresses caused by running when they take up running. So they end up running poorly, overdoing it, and the end result is they get injuries. But the good news is that if you learn to run properly and you do it sensibly, you can learn to run well, healthfully for a long time without destroying your knees. And that brings up the final kind of endurance, which is really endurance over time. And we have this idea that as we get older, it's kind of normal to be less active, right? It's like retirement, right? We get to your 60s, your 70s, you kind of be a little less active. You move to Florida, hang out on the beach. But remember, in the Stone Age, there was no retirement. And by the way, it's a misconception that people died young in the Paleolithic. We have pretty good evidence that if you survive childhood, hunter-gatherers typically live into their 70s, right? So they live nearly as long as people in countries like the United States. And the important thing is that as hunter-gatherers age, they don't become less active. In fact, they often become more active. This is a graph of how much time per day people spend foraging at different ages. These are mothers and these are grandmothers. And you can see that grandmothers are actually spending more time out there foraging. What they're doing is that humans evolved. You may have heard of the grandparent hypothesis to supply food to their children and their grandchildren. But remember, they didn't just give them checks, right? They were out there hunting and gathering and getting food, which they would then supply to their children and their grandchildren. And importantly, that physical activity turns on all kinds of repair and maintenance mechanisms. So it turns out that the older we are, the more we benefit from physical activity. And there's no study that's probably more famous in this regard than the Harvard alumni study, which was done by Ralph Paffenbarger. So Paffenbarger figured out, and any of you are alums of any university, including Harvard, that your university is never going to let you go, right? They're constantly contacting their alumni, begging them for money. And so he realized this is a perfect opportunity to study aging. So he got the Alumni Association to let him collect data on the alumni about how much physical activity they were doing. And then he waited till various alumni died. This is a study of more than 21,000 individuals. And you can see that, and then he plotted physical activity on the x-axis. So these are people getting 500 to 2,000 and more than 2,000 calories a week of exercise against their all-cause death rate. And so these are people in their 20s to 50s, their 50s, their 60s, and their 70s. And you can see that if you normalize the death rate to the sedentary individuals to a death rate of 1, when you're 20s and 30s and 40s, if you're exercising a lot, you lower your death rate by about 21%. But by the time you get into your 70s, right, you're lowering your death rate by 50%. So the older you get, the more of benefit you get in terms of health and longevity. And that brings up the final portion of the book, which is to talk about health. And of course, the biggest problem is how do you actually get help people exercise, right? And the approach that we've taken in our world today is to commercialize and industrialize physical activity as well as to medicalize it. We sell it and we prescribe it. And the proof is in the pudding. It helps some people, but obviously for the vast majority of Americans, this approach isn't really working. And I would argue that we should take an evolutionary and anthropological approach. Remember, the reason that people were physically active for most of human evolutionary history were for two reasons. One was when it was necessary, and the other was when it was rewarding. And of course, the times when it's most rewarding, think about those Tarahumara runners, is when they're doing it for some kind of social reason, right? In the case of the Tarahumara, they're doing it because their long distance races are a form of prayer. So I think we can learn a lot about how we can help people be more physically active, and I discussed that by applying these principles. Another question that is often on people's minds is like, how much should I do, right? What type should I do, right? And again, when you take a kind of medicalized approach, there's no one answer, right? And why could there be, right? Because it depends on who you are and what your background is and what your goals are. Are you worried about Alzheimer's or heart disease or just simply what age you are going to live to? And furthermore, like, what's the right dose? There is no one dose. So this is an interesting illustration of that. This is a graph based on more than 1 million Americans. And what it shows is how much moderate to vigorous physical activity people get a week, so minutes a week, against their relative risk of death, adjusted for age. And you can see if you don't exercise at all, your relative risk of death is about 1, right? But if you get just 60 minutes of exercise a week, of just moderate to vigorous activity a week, you can lower your risk of death by about 40%. If you do 150 minutes a week, so that's just 21 minutes a day, you approximate about a 50% reduction. And that's where this 150 minutes recommendation comes from. But if you do 320 minutes a week, well, you get even more benefit, and 500 gets you even more benefit. And of course, eventually it tails off. So the answer is there is no one dose, right? And there is no one a type or kind to do. You want to mix it up. Some is better than none. And if you want to do more, you're going to get more benefit from it. But eventually, those benefits diminish. And then finally, I think we need to stop making the claim that exercise is a magic bullet against disease. Now, there is no question that exercise lowers the risk of many common diseases, right? It helps prevent obesity. It's important for preventing heart disease, for respiratory tract infections. We have no data yet on COVID, but I'll make a bet that, like for other respiratory tract infections, physical activity helps improve your immune system. We know that there's compelling data that physical activity reduces your risk of cancer. It's by far the best way of preventing Alzheimer's, type 2 diabetes. It has protective effects for arthritis, for osteoporosis, for depression. The list is long. And in the final chapter of the book, I go through every single one of these diseases and explain what those mechanisms are and what the evidence is and what the doses are and all that kind of stuff. But the point I want to make is that although physical activity lowers the risk of many of these diseases, you can still get them even if you exercise, obviously. And really, it's not that exercise is a form of medicine. It's rather that it's the absence of physical activity that increases your vulnerability to these diseases, right? So it's not that exercise, we say that exercise prevents heart disease, but really a better way of saying it is that a lack of physical activity makes you much more vulnerable, much more likely to get heart disease. And it's an important distinction. And hopefully that chapter will help you understand that and why it's important. So to conclude, I hope that the book entertains and informs and enlightens. And what I really want to do is to change the way we think about exercise in particular and about the science of health in general in our culture. I think we've oversimplified things. I think we're very, some of the data we use is highly biased towards Westerners and elite athletes and towards weight loss. I think there's nothing wrong with commercializing and medicalizing exercise, but we've gone way too far in those directions. I think we're very often judgmental and uncompassionate about people who are struggling to exercise when it's, after all, an abnormal and difficult thing to do. And then finally, I hope the book is useful, right? Just as for Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who managed to make it to 87, in large part by being a gym rat and not crazy amounts of physical activity. That hopefully that the information in the book can help people make exercise fun and how it would also make it necessary and how and why it can be healthy and rewarding. But most fervently, I hope that the book helps people enjoy being active, but helps prevent us from being exercised about it. So thank you, and I look forward to answering some questions.
Thank you so much, Dan. That was absolutely wonderful. We've had a lot of great questions, so I'm going to get right into it so we have time for them. Okay. Barbara asks, what exercise is best to strengthen your brain?
Again, this is part of this kind of prescriptive thing. We all want to know like what to do. I'm not an Alzheimer's expert, and there are of course many different kinds of neurological issues. I think it's pretty clear that moderate cardio is really helpful for many aspects of brain health, and moderate exercise is good. But there's some evidence that vigorous exercise can even have extra benefits. There's lots of effects of physical activity on the brain. One of the most important is that physical activity upregulates a molecule called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic growth factor, which is a mouthful, but basically it's like miracle grow for the brain, and it helps protect the neurons in the brain and the cells that protect the neurons, and it has been shown to have all kinds of wonderful benefits. But there are other important benefits of physical activity on the brain. One of them is it's, as I said before, it helps lower Alzheimer's and so on. It's again, it's always the same answer, really. It's, some is better than none, and more is probably a little bit better. And but there's no one simple prescription.
All right, we have a great question from Ruben Rodriguez, who asks, you mentioned running as a form of prayer. Have you learned anything related to the runner's high? Any anthropological or evolutionary reason? Yeah,
so I do have a whole section on runner's high in the book. So runner's high is actually caused primarily by endocannabinoids. So they're basically, marijuana-like compounds, which your body produces when you're doing long distance, long duration physical activity. So you can't get it in a few minutes. You have to kind of get out there for an hour or two. And the cool thing about runner's high is that your body not only produces more endocannabinoids, but your body also produces more receptors. You get like a super dose. And I think, and I hypothesize in the book that the runner's high evolved to help people be foragers and hunters, right? If you're out there, think about when you're high, right? I'm sure a lot of this, being a Cambridge audience, a lot of people have some experience with this, but you have heightened sensory awareness, right? Blue becomes bluer, and your sensory perception is enhanced, right? And that can be really useful when you're hunting, right? You're looking for cues, you're looking for tracks, you're looking for information, and you guess all that information comes in, it makes you feel good. And so I believe that the runner's high evolved to help us be heightened sensory awareness when we're doing physical activity, which in turn, but also to give us some positive feedback, and dopamine, and there's other kind of good stuff that happens when you exercise. You get dopamine, which is like a molecule of more, it gives you a reward. There's serotonin and epinephrine, and all kinds of good stuff happens when you exercise that makes you happy. Opioids, lots of good things going on.
So we have a lot of duplicate questions. People are curious about the same topic. So I'm going to run through those so I can make as many people happy as possible here. You touched on a hot topic. So Mark asks, Dr. Lieberman, thank you for your excellent talk. You mentioned the prior fad of barefoot minimalist running. Where do you personally stand?
I think it's fun to run. The reason I do it occasionally is because it's fun, right? But it's not a panacea. It's not going to cure. It's not a cure-all. I think you can learn from running barefoot, because basically when you're wearing a shoe, your foot is insulated from the ground, and you have all this cushioning and stuff, right? And when you're barefoot, it forces you to run lightly and gently. And I think you can learn a lot from learning to run lightly and gently. I think good runners, whether they're wearing a shoe or not, run lightly and gently. And I think and so I think the important thing is how you run, how you use your body. And you can run well in shoes, and you can run terribly in shoes, and you can run well barefoot and terribly barefoot. But being barefoot, I think, can help you learn to run properly. But you don't need to be barefoot in order to be a good runner. And furthermore, if you suddenly take off your shoes and you read Book Born to Run, you decide, oh my gosh, I'm going to go barefoot. I'm going to be like a Tarahumara. You will injure yourself really rapidly unless you transition slowly and learn to run properly. So you've got to do it really carefully. and don't do it in New England in the middle of the winter. I would never run barefoot in this weather. No way, no how. And by the way, the Tarahumara don't run barefoot either. They wear sandals. I've never, in the 6 trips I've made to that area, I've never seen anybody barefoot there.
The other running question that I'm seeing a lot is, do you happen to have any resources for you recommend for learning proper running form?
Oh, well, there's a section on that in chapter 9. And there's a lot of good websites out there, and there are a lot of experts here in Boston, for example. There's the Spalding National Running Center that's run by Irene Davis. There's a lot of great, the McKelly Center has like lots of, there's a lot of folks here in town who can also help you learn to run properly. There's but there's a lot of good websites out there as well. It's not that hard. It's basically posture, cadence. Don't land too hard. Land with a relatively flat foot. Get your knees up. It's not that hard to learn to run properly. It's just a few skills, but you have to kind of learn the muscle memory to get good at it.
All right, we have a question from Connie. Connie Chan asks, are there differences between males and females in terms of the benefits of exercise?
Probably, yeah. I mean, for example, physical activity is important in women for lowering, well, it depends on how you express this, but just even running 20, 30 miles a week around the Charles River has been shown to lower levels of progesterone and estrogen in healthy women. And one way of thinking about it is like, it's lowering your hormone levels, but the other is that if you're not physically active, you actually have abnormally high hormone levels. And we know that there's an association between very high levels of these reproductive hormones and for example, the probability of breast cancer. So it's one of the reasons that physical activity is so protective against breast cancer. And it's more so than in terms of the effects of physical activity on testosterone. So I think that would be one example. But for the most part, I would say that the benefits are very similar no matter who you are.
We have a great question here from Winta. Winta asks, in more urban settings, is there any trade-off between outdoor physical activity and exposure to air pollution?
Ooh, interesting question. I suspect sometimes. I mean, I don't know how much good data there are on that. Certainly, I've run in some places that I felt like, after going for a run, I felt like I had smoked a pack of cigarettes, and I've never smoked cigarettes, so I'm not really quite sure what that's like. But I certainly felt the pollution. So I suspect that air quality can be a problem for outdoor running. Fortunately, that's not true in most of the year in most American cities. So, but yes, that can certainly be a factor. Again, the most important thing is getting active and finding the right environment where you can enjoy it and feel safe and feel healthy. And if that means being inside, that so be it. But certainly most people enjoy being outside more than they enjoy being inside.
A question from David Reason asks, does the relationship between exercise and decreased mortality depend on the duration in months or years that an individual has exercised?
Oh, well, so there's a lot of data on that. There's a long answer to that question. But yes, I mean, the more you do it, the more the benefit you get. But if you start later on in life, you still get some benefit. So there's studies which show the difference between people who've been lifelong physically active versus people who pick it up, or people who then stop being physically active. And so as you might imagine, the data are that lifelong physical activity is the best. Just keep it up. Don't stop as you get older. But if you've been physically inactive and you want to become more physically active, there's abundant data that there are enormous benefits from picking it up in midlife. So it's never too late to start, and there's no amount that's not beneficial.
We have a tremendous amount of questions that I'm sifting through over here. Let's see, an anonymous attendee wants to know, how do we compare in our level of exercise with other primates?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question. Yeah. So one of my favorite facts is that your average sedentary American is still more active than your typical wild chimpanzee. So chimpanzees spend about half their day feeding, and they're just kind of sitting around putting stuff in their mouth, and they're kind of mostly resting and digesting. And occasionally they go through little bouts of wild sort of activity. They fight and copulate and stuff like that. But really, we talked about the physical activity level, right? The physical activity level of sedentary humans is actually higher or sort of similar to chimpanzees. And like gorillas, oh my, gorillas are like, they're just sitting in a giant salad bowl. They like do nothing. They walk like a kilometer a day. They're not very physically active at all. So compared to other apes, humans have really dialed it up. We're much, much more physically active. And primates in general, this is work by Herman Ponzer and colleagues, primates in general are actually less physically active than most mammals. So most mammals are pretty active, primates are kind of inactive, and humans have kind of redialed it up to being more active than our primate relatives. And that's actually a very important part of our biology. We've been selected to be more active than our close cousins. Great question.
That is absolutely fascinating. A question from Jolanta Davis. Have you studied swimming, or do you know anyone who studied swimming among different cultures?
So yeah, there's not too much on swimming because humans really aren't very good swimmers. So obviously swimming is something people love to do, and there's a whole kind of scientific kind of conspiracy theory called the aquatic ape hypothesis, where people think that we evolved to swim, and that explains why we're hairless and all that sort of stuff. Not true. But swimming is obviously a wonderful thing to do, and of course there are people all around the world near oceans who swim. In many parts of the world, though, swimming is a very dangerous thing to do. Like in Africa, for example, where I do a lot of my field work, I don't swim. It's dangerous. There are crocodiles, and like if you want to like shorten your life, go for a swim in one of the rivers or lakes in the Serengeti. I don't recommend it. But so there's a reason people in some parts of the world don't swim that much. But swimming is a wonderful form of physical activity. But just remember this: when Michael Phelps is swimming making the world record in the pool, right? Swimming faster than any other human has swum before, you can still walk along the side of the pool faster than he can swim. Right? He's fast for a human being, but he ain't very fast.
All right, I think we have time for like a couple more. So many of these I want to know your answer to. Jean Kindleberger asks, what do you think of the 4-second workout that the New York Times has written about?
Oh, I just read that with great delight. Well, look, the more we study high intensity interval training, and Jean, by the way, is a former neighbor, so hi, Jean. The more we study high interval training, the more we realize that even short bursts of intensity can have really great benefits. And there's a recent paper that just came out from a lab in Texas, which showed that even repeated 4-second bouts, but these were really intense 4-second bouts, right? Actually, when they added up to a minute, really had a wonderful benefit. So it's part of this general idea that the more we study physical activity, the more we realize that mixing it up is good, right? If you go out every day and do the same walking routine, that's fine, that's great. If that's what you like to do, that's fine. But you can get some benefits by mixing it up and occasionally putting in a little bit of intensity. Over time, it's like making coffee, drip, 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 drip. Over time, you'll get some benefit from just a little bit of intensity. But remember, if you're struggling, if you're infirm, you might want to also see a doctor before you do that, because there are more risks involved with high intensity.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question. And this is probably what all of us want to know the answer to, Dan, which is Lisa asks, how can we make exercise more enjoyable?
Oof. I think there's no one answer, right? There are people who like to listen to music. They like to watch a TV show on a treadmill. That's not my thing. I think for most people, and if you look at the evidence, for most people, the way to make it more enjoyable is to make it more social. Exercising with other people, right? Whether it's as dancing, which is a form of exercise with other people, or running with a group of people, or walking with friends, or whatever. Of course, it's nice sometimes to be by yourself and have a sort of meditation, and I enjoy that too. But if you want feedback and positive reinforcement and also a commitment, right? Because I often run with my friend Aaron, and I have to meet him at 6 o'clock in the morning, and I don't want to be there at 6 o'clock in the morning, but I can't leave him out on there in the corner and there in the dark, right? So I have to go out there and join him, and by the end of the run, I'm glad I did. So making it social makes it more necessary, but it also makes it more fun. And I think the more we can we can enjoy each other's company, particularly in this day and age when we're all so isolated because of this pandemic and forced to basically live in our houses and not see anyone. The more we can find ways to interact with each other and be active while we're doing it, I think the better off all of us will be.
Well, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. And I'm so sorry to everyone whose tremendous questions I didn't get the chance to ask
I'm
tonight.
sorry too.
But until next time. So thank you, Dan, for your time and for this fascinating and ultimately compassionate event. I was nervous about, my exercise habits, and this made me feel tremendously, I don't know, better. There's so much empathy in this talk you gave. So thank you
We
for
have
that.
to stop being exercised about exercise. Yeah.
Yeah,
The bottom
I
line.
agree. I love that.
Good.
And thank you everyone for spending your evening with us. Please feel free to learn more about this book and to purchase Exercised on harvard.com. So on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, the Harvard Division of Science, the Harvard Library, and the Leakey Foundation, have a healthy, not exercised January. Keep reading, and please, please be well. Take care.
Thanks.